Yeah, as you can well imagine, it's hard to collect taxes during war. It's hard to keep business going and for business to be profitable. Yet the Ukrainian government was able to, last year, during this horrific war, collect about 39% of GDP in taxes. So they're able to cover some of their expenses, but they're running a deficit of about $3 billion a month for what I'll call the normal governance that's required during this war. One thing that you're seeing is amazing resilience. And you're seeing a government that governs. It's paying its pensions, it's paying its medical workers, it's paying its teachers. Civil servants are coming to work, maybe going to the bomb shelter 6 times a day after the siren wails, but they're working. And that is very, very important. And that $3 billion per month deficit is for those social costs. It's for those internally displaced people, of which there are 4 million inside the country, getting small subsidies. It's for pensioners and that civil service. It's being covered by your taxpayer dollars and mine and those of the EU and several other G7 countries. And luckily that $36 billion has been agreed in advance. Ukraine has just reached an agreement with the IMF for a program that over 4 years has a commitment from the IMF of $15.6 billion, but another $100 billion from allies, 80 of which is supposed to be new loans and new grants, and 20 of which is supposed to be a debt reprofiling, debt restructuring. So there is a plan for 4 years, and I think being in the IMF program means that there is kind of the seal of good housekeeping on their economic policy, which should enable them to continue to collect tax revenues and to try and maximize within reason the collection of tax revenues and ensure an investment environment that creates a bigger base for that so that they can come out of this and not need that financial help. The second piece, though, that I have to mention is what I'll call urgent and immediate reconstruction. We talk about reconstruction and people talk about, well, when the war ends, when the fighting stops, but you can't wait. You have to restore things that have been destroyed, especially if they're critical infrastructure. And Ukrainians have been doing it extraordinarily well. Every day this winter, their electricity system, their gas system, their water systems were bombed. The targets are civilian infrastructure. Over 95% of target is civilian. But they are today, after repairing it, exporting electricity again to Europe. And that tells you again about that resilience, that willingness. But there's a budget this year for about $18 billion, which is urgent reconstruction. So when you liberate a territory, you've got to put the buildings back, you've got to be able to restore water, gas, heat, basic roads and bridges, which have been blown up in the military fight. And so there is a reconstruction going on today in addition to that deficit that they're running because it's hard to collect taxes and be profitable in a war.
Would you advise investors to think about going into Ukraine even now?
Yes, I would. My old fund just closed on a $254 million private equity fund. I think investing in this part of the world requires due diligence, it requires time, you need to look for your opportunities. But the reconstruction, when we talk about the end of the war, in my view, is going to be the biggest reconstruction in our lifetimes, much bigger than the Marshall Plan. It's going to be multiples of that. And everyone is going to have an opportunity there. If you think about Ukraine, which is a technologically very savvy country, which has become even more technologically savvy during this war, applying civilian technology to military purposes and other. You think about agriculture and agribusiness, it is a source of global food security. If you think about rare earth minerals, some 90 minerals are in the Ukrainian marketplace. If the EU today imports 98% of its rare earth minerals from China, we know that we need to diversify those supply chains. This is a singular opportunity. And then above and beyond that, there's manufacturing, there's nearshoring opportunities. So I think that you need to think today about how you can identify the opportunities, how you need to prepare for those opportunities, what the capacities are that you have, what the capacities that are required to do this are, and how your government, whether it's the US or other, can support you and assist you, whether it's in first loss mechanisms, whether it's in political risk and military risk insurance or other. I think there's a great deal of work to be done to be ready so that we're not late. I think it's hard sometimes for us to think about Ukraine as it is today and as it has been for the past 10 years or so. And it really has developed really rapidly in a different direction than its nearby neighbors. So notwithstanding that we all know that there's a common culture, history, years, hundreds of years with Belarus, with Russia, it has developed so differently in the last decade that you wouldn't recognize it if you haven't been there. Civil society, we talked about, decentralization of financial power, fiscal power, decentralization as a result to decision-making on the ground, mayors, governors, transparency and technology being used to be a check on corruption, a check on governance, and an ability to influence the future. Open travel. Ukrainians travel all over the world. They've had EU visa-free travel for years. They see how that part of the rest of the world functions, and they hearken back to those values. They fought in 2013-14 for those values, with EU flags on their backs on the streets of Ukraine. I think you really have to step back and see Ukraine as it is today, not as it was 30 years ago, certainly not as it was 100 years ago.
If I ask both you and Marie the corruption question, that's always been, great people, really heroic, the worst political class in that region, decades of corruption that has really sort of stalled reform. The Ukrainian prime minister who was sitting in an American jail, I think until fairly recently, for these charges. How big a problem is corruption now?
It's a problem, but it's a problem that becomes less each day. Partly starting in 2014, again, it was a rejection of a regime that was corrupt, but we put in place mechanisms to eliminate corruption. So we put in place a transparent procurement system for state contracting, Prozoro. We've now put in place a mobile app called Dia, which allows you not to have to deal with bureaucrats to get any of your daily needs, whether it's a birth certificate or other types of government documents. You don't have to deal with them anymore. And the Western international community pressured Ukraine to implement other anti-corruption institutions, which are fully stood up today. An anti-corruption prosecutor, separate from the regular attorney general, an anti-corruption court, an anti-corruption bureau. All of this is functioning. Arrests are being made. We can all question whether any of the allegations made are true or not true. That's partly for a court to decide. But there is a lack, especially now, given this phase of the hot war, of patience on the part of the Ukrainian people for anything that would be corrupt. And so I think your greatest confidence can be that the Ukrainian people, who are showing resilience against and defiance against Russian invasion, are also going to show that same resilience and defiance against Ukrainian corruption in the future. So I think many people are phrasing it as a Marshall Plan. I think in the general direction that's accurate and that's true. The difference is going to be that this isn't going to be one donor, the United States, and 16 recipients, but it's going to be 20, 25 countries or more on the donor side, on the coordination side, with one recipient. And that changes the dynamics tremendously. There is already an agreed coordination platform. The EU, Ukraine, and the United States co-chair that platform. There have been a series of conferences, one coming up in London, June 21, 22, to talk about, in this case, how the private sector can be a part of this reconstruction. I think the Ukrainians have posted, if you're interested, on the Ukrainian recovery website, $750 billion of projects, and very clearly outlined their view that this is going to be a green Ukraine. They're not rebuilding the Soviet Ukraine, they're rebuilding and renewing a new Ukraine, a green Ukraine, a Ukraine that is EU integrated, a Ukraine that is technologically advanced and digitized, and it's a leapfrogging exercise in many, many ways. There is that outline already for anyone to see that is interested. And I think that the dialogue today on how we use, for example, the frozen Russian central bank assets is very active and ongoing. I expect you're going to hear things about that coming to fruition soon. You've got a bipartisan dialogue going with Larry Summers and Bob Zoellick out there, and expertise from University of Virginia law professor Zelikow, about how you can use these under the precedents that already have been utilized and existed in the United States, for example. Why shouldn't we start with those assets being used to start the rebuilding, since Russia's caused the devastation? And you have UN decisions, you have International Court of Justice decisions that provide for that type of action. So I think Marshall Plan, in a positive way, I would say yes, but I think it's going to be unique and different. I think Ukraine is going to be a very active and integral part of the vision and the planning of this, as it should be. And Ukrainian civil society, again, very, very active and very engaged in what should be done and how.
How much do you count on the EU? And we don't have an EU citizen on this panel, but how much should we count on the EU that's what really remade Central Europe when they joined that bloc?
I think the EU is trying to actually coordinate this and saying, the United States, you kind of did the military stuff, we'll do the rebuilding. And I actually think that the United States needs to be a critical part of it, and we can't let this be the EU-led rebuilding of Ukraine, because U.S. technology, U.S. innovation, U.S. business has to have a major part in this renewal, this rebuilding. It can't be done without the United States.